Why are so many people overwhelmed with clutter? Disorganization is causing shame, suffering, friendships, time, money. People just like you wondering where and how to create an organized lifestyle. This podcast offers expert tips and solutions for your clutter obstacles. My name is Rachel Seavey, and this is the Organized Podcast.
Hey, collectors, welcome to the Organized Podcast. Today, we're joined by Deborah Derrickson Kossmann, psychologist and author of the deeply moving memoir, which I have here, Lost, Found, Kept. In this conversation, Deborah takes us into the heart of her childhood home, which is just filled with memories and decades of her mother's compulsive hoarding. Through the emotional excavation of physical space, she uncovers much more. A layered portrait of grief, love, mental illness, and the power of objects to hold meaning. Whether you've personally lived through something similar, which a lot of you have, or you're just simply drawn to these stories of healing and family complexity, this episode's just for you. And I definitely recommend getting Lost, Found, Kept. I will have links in the comments of the podcast. Let's get into it. Hey, collectors. Today I have Deborah Derrickson Kossmann with me. Deborah, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I love your book,
Mhm.
Lost, Found, Kept, a memoir. It is absolutely so well written, collectors. You're just going to love this book. I will be having links to it on my comment section. And I just going to start some questions. I mean, what inspired you to write this memoir and what made you feel ready to share it with the world?
Yeah, it's a tough book to write. I actually started the book sooner, like 2014 or so, but I had vowed not to write about my mother until she was gone. And also, it was very hard to write the story because we weren't allowed in the house. We hadn't been in the house for more than 30 years. So I couldn't really write a story that included her without really knowing, what had happened. And we got into the house in 2016 through a series of circumstances where my mom's situation was kind of falling apart, like many people who hoard. She was having physical issues and bill paying issues, and then she had a car accident. And so we ended up being able to go into the house. And at that point, in sort of a weird way, the book kind of came together. Like once we got through the crisis part of it, what I realized was that the hoarding kind of organized the story in a weird way. That's
Yeah.
kind of the irony of it. And so the hoarding story is kind of the narrative through line of the book in terms of talking about my own upbringing and how we got to this place with my mom and my family.
Yeah. It must have been like an archaeological dig.
It was very much an archaeological dig. I mean, when you shovel literally through 3-foot piles of stuff, papers and calendars and, clothing and all kinds of stuff, and come to the bottom of the pile and you find like jewelry that you remember your mother wearing, like it's crazy. I mean, it really felt very surreal. And in the book, I try and talk about it in a way that you get the images and the sense of what it was like to be there without it being probably as overwhelming as it was to us.
Oh, yeah, because you can't capture even the smells or the crampness.
Yeah.
Did you keep a journal or take any notes or what during the
Yeah,
cleanup?
I've been a journal keeper since I was 17. I think all writers, I'm a psychologist, but also a writer. And I've always, since I started writing seriously when I was a late adolescent, I've always kept a journal. So I have like, if you talk about collecting, I probably have 70 journals.
Nice.
Um, and what's interesting about it is that I couldn't, like every day I would come back from the house, and as a way of processing my own trauma around the clean out, I would just write about what I saw, what I felt, what happened, and just kind of dump it in the journal. And so I don't believe, people talk about memoir as being cathartic, but I don't think it's really, I don't think you write memoir to process your trauma. I think you write memoir after you've already done that work.
Mhm.
So, but what allowed me to sort of access a lot of that material was having, a lot of the book descriptions and stuff came from stuff that I had written in my journals. And then also there are some pictures in the book that my friend Jackie, who is a photographer with a national news organization, she came and took some pictures because I was afraid I was taking some pictures, but it was so overwhelming that I wanted somebody to come in and sort of like I said to her, just come in and like document it a little bit for me because I'm not gonna I can't contain all of it.
Wow, wow, that's just incredible. And the title, Lost, Found, Kept, it's so meaningful. How did you choose it?
Yeah, the original title for the book was What We Hold On To, but it's not, it wasn't so grammatical and it was sort of hard to search. So the publisher was like, we need
Mm.
to have a different title. And I had written the book, and the sections in the book were the same: Lost, Found, Kept. And we toyed around with a bunch of different titles, some of which played off the epigraphs that are at the beginning of the book, the poem by Adrienne Rich and the quote by Rilke. But then none of those were quite right either. And so we finally, I definitely wanted a title that wasn't a lengthy like title and then blah 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 blah. So we ended up, my editor actually said to me, she's like, what if we just use the Lost Found Kept, like sort of like an Eat, Pray, Love kind of
Yeah.
idea. And I was like, I really like that idea. And my publisher, I thank God, was like so good about like just like let's just leave it at Lost Found Kept, a memoir, and like let it stand on its own without a lot of explanation in the title. And I feel like it really works because the book, it really ties the themes of the book together.
Yeah, no, I love the title. Um, Now in writing of this book, how did your understanding of legacy, like your mother's legacy and even your legacy, did it change from not being in there for 30 years and now you're kind of seeing all this stuff?
Yeah, well, we knew things were bad. Like we knew she was hoarding, but we didn't know the extent of it. And really, it started when I was an adolescent, and my sister and I started to separate. So going into the house was sort of, it was very trippy because it was sort of like my memories of that were from 30 years ago, and then to walk into what it had become was quite traumatic for both my sister and I. I think, it's interesting. The legacy, I think, in my family is that we've often lost things and then found them again. It's a theme through the book. And in a way, the legacy of the book is also about sort of keeping my mother. I mean, I think in the end, we sort of, she was able to, she lived on 7 years after we cleaned out the house. She moved into assisted living. She actually passed away in 2023. So the book was written before she died. She did not ever see it. But I feel like I tried to make, it a very compassionate story about both her and myself. That this was a complicated relationship and that the legacy of it ultimately is love and being able to still have a relationship.
Yeah. Did you ever feel torn between your role as a daughter and your understanding as a psychologist?
Oh yeah. I write about it a little bit in the book because I think, I joke and it's not really a joke, it's the truth, is that we sort of did everything you weren't supposed to do to help somebody in a hoarding situation.
Mm,
Because the recommendations, hoarding's not well understood by my field,
no.
and there's not a lot of understanding about what treatments are effective for hoarding. What is true is that by the time you reach what we call level 5 hoarding, which is where my mom was, it's a
Mhm,
crisis.
mhm.
So, I mean, when you deal with this, I had so much anger and so much resentment about having to, rescue her from this house essentially, and that it fell on me to sort of do all of it along with my sister and our spouses, that, that it's very hard to think about, being a psychologist and being enraged, which I really was. And
Yeah.
it was funny because when I was writing the book, I kept asking people like, do I sound like I'm too angry? Like, because I was really angry. Like, but I also think, the beauty of anger is that it keeps you activated. It gives you strength to not give up. Anger is energy. You can use it for good or for evil. And in my case, the anger was what sort of fueled us to continue the clean out and to do what had to be done. Otherwise, I think we would have collapsed. I mean, I think both my sister and I, it was so painful and so difficult.
Were you mostly angry? I'm sorry, this is off
Oh
script.
no, that's
Because your mom left you with a project to clean up? Was it because she was living like that and didn't ask for help? What was it a combination?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of all of those things. We had been talking to her for a long time about like, hey, like we can come in and help you clean out and downsize. And we know that the house is like kind of complicated for you and, trying to be understanding. And I think one of the things that people don't, people who live with a mentally ill parent or have a relationship with a mentally ill parent, you know, until, as long as you're functioning, you can be autonomous and make your own decisions and do what you need to do. And so my mom was autonomous. She functioned at a very high level for most of her life. And so it wasn't like we could just barge in there and say, give us the keys, we're cleaning out the house. So I think, feeling the anger about being stuck with, we knew that this was bad and you didn't ask for help, feeling anger about that, feeling the shock and the anger about like, this is, anger is always over sadness in a way. So there was grief and sadness that she was living like this and
Oh,
couldn't ask for help. So I think it's a whole combination of things. It was a kind of, big feeling stew of stuff.
oh, I can imagine. I walk in with family members, first time seeing a home. Oh, I've done it hundreds of times, and that's not an appropriate time to ask that question. So thank you for sharing.
Hmm.
Because I see the face, the emotion. I've seen, kids run out,
Yeah.
crying. I see just a range, and it just hard, and you don't say, how are you feeling exactly right now? So it's nice to know, have you just explain the emotion of being someone walking into that, and then realizing the part in your book where she had no running water.
Yeah.
That really, yeah, I've had that conversation with family members, and they go, she has no plumbing. And
Yeah.
I'm very politely, I'm like, no, it's actually been out for 3, 5 years. And
Yeah.
they're like, well, what is she doing? And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, she's been using poise pads, or she's driving to
Yeah.
Trader Joe's 5 times a day, or a combination of both, or, but it's very hard to have that conversation with someone because they just can't even imagine that their family member is going through that.
Well, and I think to your point about what the difference is between being a daughter and a psychologist is that the horror of like not being able to help and the shame around that. Like, I think as a professional, like, I know what I would recommend to family members and stuff about how to handle it. But it's like, I think there is a tremendous amount of shame about these situations, about not being able to caregive as a daughter or as a family member to help because the person's not willing. I mean, hoarding is a pretty intractable diagnosis. I mean, it's really only been a diagnosis in the DSM since 2013. So it's like it's not even that well understood.
No, no, and I hear you on the shame. I have a mentally ill parent, and I've shared that on the podcast a lot. And I've shared just the shame I feel for not being able to like communicate, connect, help.
Yeah.
And then I see people doing this, helping their parents all the time. So it makes it hard because I'm like, I want to be that person, or do I want to, I'm constantly wondering if I
Yeah.
should be that person or if I should just keep to myself. But there is a lot of shame. And then as a child, there was shame that my house wasn't like everyone else's, that my mom wasn't like everyone else's.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of shame as a child of someone that's mentally ill in general.
Yeah. And I think it's complicated because even after all this happened, I mean, my mother was not nice about this. I mean, even after all the stuff that we did, And I think that's the complicated part about caregiving is that you're doing it out of, all kinds of reasons, but also the other person's not grateful. I mean, my mother still, talked about assisted living till the day she died that we had put her in prison.
Yes.
You know?
Oh, yeah. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, now, was there anything that you uncovered that kind of helped you understand her more? Like, at what point did that anger shift to kind of maybe something else?
Well, I think the anger did not shift to something else
Okay.
till a while after, I mean, a while after we were resolved and she was relocated, because she was very difficult about it. So it was a very difficult, at least for I would say really for like a good year and a half after we did the house clean out and stuff. I think it continued to be pretty difficult and pretty loaded. I found some stuff and I write about it, finding some albums that she had carefully curated and then kind of, were strewn about the house about her upbringing that she had really wanted to leave as a record. Like my mother was a very frustrated creative person and really wanted, to write and to, be artistic and to do those things. And she actually was a really good writer, but she like curated a photo album. She went back to where she grew up and she curated a photo album about all these landmarks and some stories about the landmarks and stuff. And like finding that was interesting because she was the same age that I was as I was cleaning out the house. And it was this idea of sort of going back and kind of putting things together or kind of, looking at your own memories in the context of aging and of knowing that these things are going to be gone and who's going to appreciate them, you know?
Yeah. And what did healing look like for you?
That's a big question.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is. It is.
I think, I think in a weird kind of way, as difficult as it was to clear out that house and to find it, there was something very healing about that being out in the open. And what it was for me, and like you said about your own mom, right, is that you live a life where you're protective usually of your mentally ill parent. Like all my life, like my mom functioned pretty well in a lot of ways. So nobody saw in a way how mentally ill she was or how difficult her life was in some ways. And so for me, there was this real disconnect because from a very young age, and I write about this in the book, I was aware that there was something off, that she was different. And there were some wonderful ways that she was different in terms of her creativity and how she parented us. But there were also some very not so wonderful ways about how she parented me in particular. I had a different relationship with her than my sister. And so going into that house in a way was freeing because it was like, you know what? Like this is, this is what's inside, literally, is a mess, kind of. And in a way, it was kind of validating in some ways to sort of say, you know what, it's always been like this. Now there's sort of tangible proof in a way. Like I'm not crazy. Like it's always been, she's always struggled. This has always been true about her, you know, in different ways. So I think there was that. And then I think writing the book has been really interesting for me because some of the thing, like you're connecting with certain aspects of it, it's been, not being alone. The whole point of art, right, is to connect people and to leave us with a sense of like, we're not alone in the world. These experiences are shared experiences, even if the specifics of them are very different. And so I think that's been very healing.
Yeah. So if listeners are facing something similar as you are, do you have any advice that you would offer them?
Yeah, I do. There's some thinking about this. One of the things, for family members of folks with hoarding is to get lots of support for yourself. I'm very lucky and fortunate that I have lots of very good friends and chosen family, and I have my sister and some other family members who might have complicated family, as you read about. But like, being able to lean on those folks. I mean, fortunately, I have a husband who's like, we joke that he gets a get out of jail free card for anything he ever wants to do in the future after shoveling at my mother's house. Um, but
Yeah.
I think, being able to have a good therapist, being able to find support. There are some groups that are supportive in different communities where you can get some help with this. Some of the county offices on aging have help with this. Having a professional organizer, I've been talking to people about NAPO and some of the other clean out. There's some elderly, like where they come in and they clean out the house. I was talking to somebody who does that for a company down south, like there are resources, where you can get help going through this, which is super important. We chose not to do that, partly because of my mom's budget, but also because of the circumstances of the house.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's really important. And also to think about this as not enabling the person with the hoarding disorder, but perhaps being able to make interventions with your family member to help them have a better quality of life. So things like stopping the mail or cleaning up in functional ways around the house so that it's not a safety or a fire hazard, because those are huge things, especially with more extreme levels of hoarding, or being able to repair the roof of the house if something goes wrong, like to be able to help the person with hoarding disorder at least be able to function in a better, safer way. And
Yep.
that may be what you have to do until things come to the point where you have to step in more,
Yeah.
aggressively.
Yeah, no, that's a really good suggestion. And I recently worked with a niece that was helping her aunt, and she went in and finally was able to take over her finances and was just shocked of all the things that hadn't been paid, all the, QVC shopping that was being on auto
Ugh.
subscription.
Yeah.
So she
Ugh.
made a huge difference stopping the mail, stopping the auto subscriptions, taking these bills under her control. And I know with you, there was a lot of reluctancy there, and same with her. But once they finally got to that point, it was a lot easier, at least with the paperwork and incoming.
Yeah.
And her being able to see what her aunt was really doing was really helpful because sometimes people need that help managing their finances, catching up on bills, and not just cleaning up the stuff and getting it out of there, but just, that kind of clerical help. And really
Yeah.
important.
Well, and I think also like the percentage of people with hoarding disorder is like 1 in 50, 1 in 40. The statistics vary a little bit, but in the older population, so in the regular population, it's like a 2% of the population has hoarding disorder, but in the elderly or the aging population, it's more like 6% because some of the issues about cognitive decline and physical illness and stuff really impact how people function. So to your point, that was probably tremendously helpful to her aunt.
Oh, yeah, and excuse me, I've done things where I've helped clients set up automatic bill pay, canceled things for them too. So it's hard. I know sometimes you have to be a power of attorney for things, but sometimes you can do things and not be a power of attorney and just call up, return devices, take things back to Comcast or Xfinity. There are lots of ways that you can help someone besides just dealing with the clutter because it does add up. There are a lot of bills that are coming in that are stacked up, and so that's just something that I've actually never talked about on my podcast as a way to help somebody
Yeah.
who's suffering because sometimes they're just so overwhelmed that they don't realize that they have an auto delivery coming every single month. It just stacks up, their card gets charged. That's really common. I see that a
Yeah.
lot. And it's really sad. Some of these companies are very predatory, but that's a whole nother.
Well, and just difficult. My mom was having trouble, like, paying her phone bill regularly. And I
Mhm.
ended up taking over. I talk about this in the book before she had her auto accident and we went into the house a month or two before I had taken over her bill situation. And there was unpaid taxes and there was stuff that, she was running out of money. And, the house was really her only asset. And when we went into the house, we were just like, oh my God, like we had to sell the house we sold that house and a flipper took it on. We got a pretty good
Oh,
price for it for the shape that it was in. And he sold
yeah.
it for almost 3 times what he bought it for.
Yes.
And, it's like, it's heartbreaking because she could have used that money, but on the other hand, I mean, I
Oh,
think people don't want to make change. They don't want to move. I mean, one of the things about hoarding disorder is that you're kind of stuck in what you're doing. And, people have a clutter blindness. They don't see what's around them and they don't see it as a problem. And, even if it really is, and I think that that makes it very hard to address.
It does. And I found, and I work with a lot of seniors, nobody wants to lose their independence. Nobody, I mean, I don't want to. Nobody wants to
Mm,
think about that. And so it's almost like a fight for independence. From an outside looking in, and I hear them, they're my client, they're saying, I don't want to move, and my daughter's telling me that I'm not, healthy enough to stay in the house alone. And, I've been living here for blah, 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 and she's never, and I hear the whole rant. And then the daughter's just like, very concerned and wants to help. And so I'm sure this sounds really familiar to you. And I'm usually in the middle of it and I can see both sides and I can see
yeah,
the person clinging to their independence. Like, I'm fine walking, but they're not. Like I can see that they're not okay walking
right,
or it's not a
right.
safe house, but it's like, it's this like, I don't want to go to assisted living. That's a huge,
Oh, totally,
oh, it's
totally.
so hard. And um, do you think your professional background made it harder or easier going through all of this?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I think my professional background probably, helped me deal with her in some ways and helped me sort of, have some distance sometimes. But, when I'm not working, I'm what I call off the clock. So I'm a person like anyone else who's a daughter, a wife, all those things, right? So I think it can help in some ways. It helped. I think what it did help with is the understanding that, this is an illness. And I think sometimes families think about it as the person's just lazy or they're deliberately being difficult or whatever. It's a mental illness. And I think it's very hard when you're the child of someone with a mental illness to really have empathy for that because you have to deal with the outcome of that. And sometimes mentally ill parents are not easy people to deal with. I am a poster child for that. And my mother was an interesting, bright, she always encouraged my writing. She was a book person. She was like, growing up, she, fostered and encouraged our creativity and our engagement in the world. And she was really a good teacher and she was an excellent nurse. She took care of people in a very loving and caring way. But like all of those things coexist with the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I work for a lot of nurses that also, at home they're totally overwhelmed with clutter, and they give themselves to helping and then they don't really take care of themselves.
One of the interesting things about that is like a lot of mental health professionals and nurses, there's a lot of trauma. What we know also about hoarding is that sometimes the actual hoarding behavior starts as an outcome, an aftermath of grief or trauma. In my mother's case, I think she had it before, but it really took off when her mother died, when my grandmother died, because we could see it sort of in the archaeology of the hoarding in the house. And I think for a lot of folks with hoarding disorder, somebody dies or there's a big trauma or a big loss. And hoarding becomes a way of literally building a wall around yourself and about holding on to things that have meaning. They may not have meaning to other people, and they may not even seem like they should have meaning, but they do to that person. And that's why it's so hard. You can't just go in and clear out the clutter because that's a trauma for the person with hoarding disorder. You know, I
Yes.
mean, I don't understand why you're keeping 75 years of magazines or whatever, but like to that person, that's not junk.
No, that's their collection of sewing magazines. If they donate it, it's only to the specific, outfit that,
Yeah.
wants them. But no, it's collections and it's their life. Sometimes maybe when they were younger they couldn't afford all those magazines. So something about having the
Hmm.
stuff, makes them feel like they've made it in life, like they're doing okay.
Well, I think that's a really good point. Like I was a very I reached my full height. I'm 5'10" when I was in seventh grade. And at that time you couldn't find shoes. I was a size 10 shoe. At that point, you couldn't find size 10 women's shoes. So I have a bit of a shoe hoarding. I joke about it. I have a bit of a shoe hoarding problem. Like I love buying shoes because now you can get shoes in size 10 and a half and 11 and 10 and and I think that that is about, in a way, the trauma of not having, like when you're younger. So I think for a lot of people, especially people like Depression era people who grew up during the Depression when they're one, I was talking to somebody who came from a family of immigrants and sort of having not having anything and having to start over and collecting things and keeping things like you never know what you're going to need when there's going to be a crisis. So some of that plays into some of the hoarding stuff too.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much plays into an object. And you wouldn't know just going into a house that just an item has that much meaning to it.
Mhm.
And so coming in, absolutely. And I can't stress it enough. And just throwing away people's stuff is not the right way to go. And sometimes my job can be very slow and it can feel like tug of war, but at the end of the day, the person has made the decision of what stays and what goes. Um,
Yeah. Which I think, which is when we talk about what I didn't do right, right? Is that in crisis level situations where
yep.
the roof is falling, right? We removed her and what's
Yeah.
interesting about my mother, however, was she never asked to go back there. She asked about particular objects, but she knew, like in the book, I talk about this, like she knew on the one hand, she couldn't do anything about it on the other hand, but like she knew. So I think, that was sort of a thing. When I read those, how to deal with hoarding disorder, and they're like, help the person sort out their papers. And I'm like, have you seen 3 foot piles like in it fill entire rooms of like
Right.
stuff? Like we would have been there for 40 years.
No, no, I get it. No,
Like, but to
I
your point, like that is how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to give the person control over it. And I think whenever you can, that is the right thing.
in there are definitely circumstances, safety, yeah, forget about it. If it's stacks of paper and they're about to fall on her, catch on fire, moldy, rodent damage, we will quickly make sure there's no photographs or money or,
Yep.
sometimes yeah, but it's out. So I mean, I do understand in an emergency situation, you've got to make big decisions, but I can imagine because I can tell the kind of person you are even you can't even in that situation you might come across some things that you put to the side. You're not
Oh,
just
totally.
blindly shoveling and you're looking, okay, old bills up, photograph, old bills up, $5, or so it's kind of
Yeah.
even in emergency you are kind of sifting as quick as possible. And then
Yeah.
it's funny because some of my colleagues won't work with someone that has hoarding disorder because they're just like, oh, it's so slow, it's you know and I get it, and I think I'm just the queen of patience. I don't know, they're like, I don't know how you do it, you sat there for 5 hours and went through one pencil box with her. I'm like, yeah, but the pencils, most of them are gone. Like it's such a process, but they're like, nope, that's why I refer you.
Uh-huh.
So
Yep.
you have to be really patient if it's not an emergency,
Yep.
you know, you do,
Absolutely.
because it's hard for that person. They're already embarrassed, whether you're a family member or a professional or a neighbor, friend, they're embarrassed, whether they share that with you or not. There's
Mhm.
shame, there's, worrying about being judged. And so I really like to, like you said earlier, and that's sometimes I explain it to the people that work for me. It is a mental illness. Sometimes
Yeah.
things don't make sense at all. And then that's when I'm just like, you know what? It's a mental illness. And it just
Yeah.
helps me understand
Yeah.
because it's out of my scope. I don't have the training that you have. And then sometimes, like, we're all looking at each other like, hey,
Hmm.
like, why would she keep that?
Hmm.
And then I'm like, mental illness
Yeah.
because, and people don't realize that. It's like you said, it's not because they're lazy or, you know, it's not a bunch of kind of judgy reasons why they're hoarding,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Um, and that always helps me as a professional dial down my own, like, oh my gosh, they're keeping
Yeah.
so much. And I'm like, it's a mental illness, it's a process. I'm constantly referring therapy, groups, peer-led groups.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for the person who's hoarding, the one treatment that does seem like it does make some difference is doing the group stuff with the person with hoarding disorder. Like I dip in and out of a bunch of Reddit groups, the Child of Hoarder, Children of Hoarder. There's a hoarding group that has 66,000 people in it. And one of the things that they do in that group is like they share pictures of like a room that they're working on cleaning out, and the other group members encourage them and stuff. Now, granted, these may be more motivated folks when it comes to the hoarding situation, but it's been fascinating to me because that group support actually they're looking at maybe Medicare. Who knows what happens now,
Yes.
but maybe Medicare like helping to like
Oh,
SAMHSA like sort of setting up groups to be helpful to people, and that peer support sort of takes away some of the shame and just like any kind of group therapy or group support, some of the shame and aloneness with it. And a lot of these people are craving community and connection with other people. I think that's what people don't tend to understand. They're sort of making this wall around themselves, but also they're lonely a lot of times because of the situation. My mom over time, like by the time everything really came to a head, a lot of her friends had died or had been, relocated. And my mom was intensely social and had some very good friends. And, I think that was hard. She was a lot lonelier. And after she died, it was funny to us because she always called the assisted living a prison. And we were like, is she really happy there? And I should also mention all of this happened pre-COVID. I don't know what would have happened if we had been in this situation and COVID had happened. It would have been a nightmare. Fortunately, she was resettled by the time that happened. And, after she died, a bunch of people were cleaning out her room, which I will also mention was kind of a mini version of hoarding. Just because you've relocated someone does not mean the behavior stops. She had much less space and there was much less stuff, and it was sort of clean hoarding, if you want to call it that. But there was definitely some of that. But it was interesting because all of the like a bunch of the staff would stop in and like, we love your mom. Your mom was so great to us. And, other residents would come in and stuff. And I was like, you kept this whole life like secret from my sister and I, like that you had a life here. You made a life for yourself here, but you weren't going to let on to
no,
us
no, she wasn't.
that she
Oh my
had
God.
done that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I love it. This just, I mean, I've been in stories like this. It's so funny. I mean, I could talk to you forever. No, because it's hilarious. I go into the assisted living and because they say it started again and it's like all of the sugar packets and juices and napkins and stuff and newspapers from the assisted living has now been brought into the
Uh-huh.
room. And so it doesn't just end because you go to assisted living. And I think that's what people think, like, oh, mom's fine now. She's in assisted living. It's like, no, she might try and save, anything,
Hmm.
and be really creative about it. And then, yeah, same kind of thing. I check on them. Oh, it's great here. And then, family calls and they're like, I hate it. It's a prison.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you're so friendly. And I tell the family, I go, listen, they're really, they're doing great. They're pleasant whenever we go over there. And they're just like, really? And I'm like, yeah, they love us. Um,
Very complicated,
it's
as you
very
know. Family
complicated.
relationships are very complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the peer group, that was one thing I love that. Yeah. We have a peer group here in San Francisco at the Mental Health
Oh,
Association.
that's great.
Oh, it is fabulous. There's lots of members and they're all intermingled and they help each other and then they go out and do things sometimes together that's just
Hmm.
not even clutter related. And I just think it's so cute. I love when
That's
I hear about like,
great.
oh,
Yeah,
you
no,
know
that's
each other.
great.
That's so cute. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I just we'll wrap things up, but one last question would be if a listener walks away with just one message or feeling from your book, Lost, Found, Kept, what do you hope it is?
I mean, I wrote the book to tell the story. And I didn't shy away from writing about difficult things that happened in my family. And I think one of the things that's really important to me is that for people to recognize that you're not alone. Like other people, even professionals, have complicated families with mentally ill parents, with complicated stories like the hoarding, and that the shame around some of that and the sense of aloneness and not being, normal, so to speak, like that stuff, I would hope that I think it's true in a lot of memoirs that it's a universal experience that you're connected in a way. It's your own community, it's your own way of, having empathy and understanding for other people, but also that I hope people recognize, that they aren't alone, that there's people that have been through it as well and have been there and have experienced it, and that you can get through it, because I think ultimately my book is about resilience, and about, how we save each other, how we keep each other in relationship, as difficult as it is. And it was very difficult in many times, in many cases.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Well, thank you so much for writing this memoir.
Oh,
And
thank
I will
you.
be actually giving away a copy on my private Facebook group this week. So that,
Oh, that's great.
yeah, yeah.
That's
And
great. And
I'm
and
thank you
yeah.
for being on the show.
Thank you. And I just invite, and your readers, if you love it, please give me a good review on Amazon or Goodreads. And if I would also like if people have book groups where they want to read it in their book group, I'm available to Zoom in. You can find more information out about all that on my website, which is lostfoundkept.com.
Okay.
And it was a pleasure to talk to you about everything.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that you would pop in on a group. That's kind of tempting. We'll see
Absolutely.
if I can
Yeah,
get some people together. That's great.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd love to have you back on again. This
That
is
would be great.
probably a never-ending conversation.
I'm happy to come anytime, Rachel, honestly.
Thank you. Well, have a
Good.
great day.
You
Thank
too. It
you.
was very nice to meet you. Thanks. All
Okay.
right.
Okay, collectors. That was Deborah Derrickson Kossmann, the author of Lost, Found, Kept, a memoir. If this conversation resonated with you or brought someone in your life to mind, I highly, highly encourage you to pick up this book. It is so well written. It's raw, reflective, it's ultimately hopeful, and it's a story not just about what we lose and what we find, but what we choose to keep. And it's about people, memory, and home. Thanks for listening to the Organized podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you share it. You can like it, you can comment, and make sure you're subscribed. Until next time, collectors. And remember, happiness is a place between too little and too much.
Thank you for listening to the Hoardganized podcast. Please make sure you're subscribed and join our Hoardganized podcast Facebook page and get additional tips and challenges.